Theoretical Foundation Part 1. The Lost Self. 70 years ago, pediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald W. Winnicott developed a theory of the self as a psychic structure that is still generally recognized today. Herein, he differentiates between two different self structures, a true self and a false self. The true self is a self structure that contains the innate capabilities of a person striving for development. One could say the central self, true self, is the inherited potential that experiences a continuity of being and, in its own way and at its own pace, acquires a personal psychic reality and a personal body schema, Winnicott 2014. It goes without saying that this potential can only develop if it is promoted by the primary caregiver, and the person then makes his own efforts in the course of his life to develop his potential. Unfortunately, this process only occurs very rarely because many people are heavily influenced by external factors such as upbringing, traumas, neglect, repression, and emotional abuse. Winnicott describes the development of a false self through the experience of not having critical needs met from an early age. An infant is reliant, particularly with the greatest dependency of the primary caregiver, on the fact that his essential needs, such as love, security and comfort, and a positive attachment, are satisfied. If this should not be the case, the infant must adapt to the environment on account of this failure and develops a false self. Winnicott states, if the primary caregiver is not in the position to react to the needs of the infant, but instead replaces the needs of the infant with his/her own gesture, then the infant must comply so that the false gesture of the environment makes sense. This form of compliance is the earliest stage of the false self. The false self reaction of the infant is the adequate response to the failure of the social environment. Through the false self, the infant forms a false system of relationships. By means of introjections, the false self can even fake authenticity, so that if the young child grows up and continuously identifies with the caregivers and develops a self of compliance. Pathologically speaking, this is when the actually split off compliant false self is considered the whole child. The close from Winnicott's theory is critical for me as a psychologist and therapist and for my work. The core of the problem for many people is the authority of the parents, from an early age into adulthood. Under these conditions, The true self no longer has a chance to come into contact with real life, and thus life itself becomes empty. In the effect, Winnicott has observed the following behaviors. One observes extremely restlessness, inability to concentrate, and a need to incur disturbing influences from the external reality in such persons in place of cultural activities, so that the lifetime of the individual can be filled with reactions to these disturbances. The lost self and the development of a false self is the tragedy and the fate of Donald Trump. This psychological embedding is elementary for the further explanation of the biographical background of the Trump family.